I'm going to start deliberately directly on 11:30. There's been a discussion downstairs. Apparently lunch starts at noon. So the nice thing is the lines will have alleviated by the time I'm finished this talk, I'll guarantee you. All right. So this James Bach gets a premier co-authorship on this. James and I, you know Lennon and McCartney, how they gave each other credit for other people's stuff. Think of me as Ringo in this, but there we go. And I guess this is really weird too, because I'm in my own light, which is not very satisfying for me. Oh well, what are we going to do? All right, here we go, Hall of Shame time. And you're not going to be able to read this from the back, so I'll read it for you. You've moved this meeting, but the organizer won't see the change. To keep the meeting at the original time, click cancel and don't save your change. If you click OK, the meeting will remain at the wrong time on your calendar. Okay, but enough about things that suck. Let's talk about Microsoft products. Here's something. Isn't that helpful? This is my favorite sort of thing. You can't look at stuff like this and think, did anybody ever believe that this is going to help somebody solve a problem? That's our problem with software today. Our problem with software today. Oh, and if you actually want to go now and be on time for lunch, here it is. Testing doesn't slow you down, but prudence might. That's, if you get nothing else from the talk, you can take that. You could go now if you really want. Okay. A lot of people in the Agile community are squishy and iffy about all the roles in the world except for two, customer and programmer, customer and developer. And a lot of the time, with some good reason for it, they might say, well, why don't we just get rid of roles? Why don't we just get rid of roles? We don't need the testing role. We don't need the documenter role. The developers will document their own stuff. Yeah. You've probably experienced this. If something is not somebody's focus, it's not going to remain their core competence. It's not going to be their responsibility. So, what's our proposal? Instead of thinking of roles as silos, or as prisons, or as fortresses, which is what we think of roles as when we are saying stuff like, well, that's the stuff that only I do, and there's all this other stuff that I don't do. So one interpretation is a prison, the other is a fortress. Let's think of roles like this. Let's think of a role as a villa. A villa is a semi-private space. Somebody maintains it, somebody lives in it, and they invite guests. So developers can help testers, and testers can help developers in their roles all the time. Developers check their code, but in rapid software testing at least, we have this idea of the responsible tester. The responsible tester is someone who is responsible for not doing all the testing work, but for making sure that the testing work gets done, and is also responsible for cleaning up the mess after the guests show up at the villa. So, flexible social distance is the idea there. And we can exploit that in order to remember something really, really important about software development, and that is we are insiders. And what we saw in those two error messages there are things that are probably not going to satisfy the outsiders. Let's go into that in detail for about the next, not quite an hour. How are responsible testers different from developers? Well, what are developers? Developers are, first of all, agents. They're responsible for making their own choices and doing their own stuff to a very significant degree. They are craftspeople, artisans. They take responsibility for the quality of their work, and they strive to make it better if they don't feel like it's good enough. A developer is also a service provider, providing service for other people. A developer is an analyst. And a developer is a maker of things. That's what the developer role is all about. The developer role is, I will make things that end your troubles. That's what developers do, which is great. The developer mentality has almost everything in common with the tester mentality except for one enormous difference. Where the developer is a maker, The tester is a critic. I will find trouble wherever I look. Nobody else on the team is in that role. Nobody else on the team is taking the perspective, we're going to look for trouble. Everybody else is working on envisioning success, not on anticipating failure, as we shall shortly see. That means that there's a sort of cognitive conflict between the tester role and the developer role, especially if it's in the same person, and especially if it's in the same person at the same time. I mean, developers, you know what it's like when you have to confront that moment when either you or somebody else look at your own stuff in terms of trouble. It's like this. It's like a dog being given a bath. Now, the dog, somewhere inside, the dog knows it's good to be given a bath, even though the dog would prefer to stink of fish that he just rolled in on the beach. But it's still not exact. It's like going into the sauna and then going into the ocean. I knew it'd be sort of okay, but I still had that kind of icky feeling about it. So the testing that testers do is socially challenging in two important senses. One is we are challenging the product and our beliefs about it in a social context. And it's also socially challenging because that's kind of socially awkward. Nobody wants to know about trouble. They do want to know about trouble, but they're not necessarily happy about it. A few years ago, I was in the privileged position of being the conference chair for the Eurostar testing conference, 2013. And I didn't want to do it. Being a conference organizer, Siggy, where are you? Siggy? Yeah, there you are. You know this. Being a conference organizer is a pain in the ass. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of trouble. You got to coordinate all these people. But I thought this would be worth it if only we could get Harry Collins in front of the crowd. Harry Collins is one of the more important sociologists of science. He followed gravity wave physicists around for 40 years and reported on what it was like to do that. And we got him to write an abstract for the role of social science in testing. And my God, if you look at it, he did a better job than any of us testers have ever done on establishing what the key difference is, following on this distinction I made a few years ago between testing and checking, which we'll see in a minute. He said, I'm going to violate the prime rule and read the slide. Computers and their software are two things. They're machinery, interacting cogs, gears, wheels, bearings. And I mean, the first computer was literally like that. It had to be checked because it literally was gears and wheels and cogs. That's Babbage's difference engine. And of course, when you're checking something mechanical, you have to make sure that all the parts are there and they fit together and so on. But he says that's the easy part of testing. Let's call that checking. Checking is operating a product algorithmically, mechanistically to check specific facts about it. And in this context, this is only one kind of use of tools in testing. Talk about automation in testing always focuses on this thing, which is the most boring and uninteresting part of testing, checking the output. Interacting with the product in specific algorithmic ways to collect specific observations in a very formal algorithmic sense, applying algorithmic decision rules, true, false, yes, no, green, red, 1, 0, to the outcome of those observations, and then relaying the outputs of the evaluations algorithmically. Think spelling checker. What does a spelling checker do? Goes through a body of text, tokenizes the words, compares each word to the contents of a dictionary. If the word isn't in the dictionary, it gets a little red wavy line under it. If it is in the dictionary, no little red wavy line. But nobody calls that automated editing. Nobody else makes that mistake, the same mistake that we make in software development, where we call that automated testing. So a check can be performed by a machine that cannot think, but has the virtue of being very fast, very precise, or by a sufficiently disengaged human being, a human being who's been told, shut up, don't do anything other than these steps that I've asked you to do. And I don't like this stuff. Nobody likes this stuff. This is the most boring, the most uninteresting part of testing. It's necessary, but it doesn't really focus on what's important about testing. It's very good and fast for signaling anticipated easy bugs. But when you compare that to the humans who are slow and error-prone when they're being forced to act like machines, this looks awfully good. But let's think about some of the advantages of having humans actually look at and interact with the product. Humans are adaptable. They're able to recognize things that are surprises that the machinery cannot recognize. The machinery doesn't have any understanding of whether something is a bug or not. And when the machine encounters surprising behaviors, it either ignores it or it crashes. Plus, the human tester has social competence. Well, depending on the tester, some social competence. But the thing about the mechanical form of testing is it's not universally good. It allows us to do bad testing faster and worse than we've ever done bad testing before. This is something that came to us from Harry's work. I'm spelling this word wrong to show that spelling checkers don't understand human intentions. Now, what's a spelling checker going to do with that? Probably a little red wavy line. What would a human do with it? A human editor would say stet and let it go. Because the human editor will understand the intentions of the author in trying to prove that point about spelling checkers. And that's something we always got to keep in mind when we're talking about the easy part of testing, the part that is mechanistically checkable. See, as Harry points out, machines are like social prostheses. They're like artificial arms or artificial hearts or artificial insulin pumps. And what an insulin pump does is not at all like what a real human set of pancreas and endocrine systems does. An insulin pump does not really replace the thing that it's purported to replace, and it's somebody who's staring down the prospect of diabetes. I don't want that, because the machinery doesn't do the same thing that the human pancreas does. Yeah, I know. When I saw this shot, I thought, oh, this is going to impress some people, maybe, I don't know. Well, computers are like that too. They're social processes. They fit into society in places where humans once fit or where a human with certain superpowers could fit, the capacity to account for 100,000 transactions a minute. But the humans have to adapt to make up for the difference between what the machinery does and what a human would do, exercising social competence, wisdom, judgment in the same place. So, here's Babbitt. Oh, you've seen this picture before. That was my label for it. Here is the label that Office 365, I think, put on it. A picture containing indoor floor, chair, and room. Really? In fact, 1, 2, 3, I don't think there's, it's indoors, it's true. Floor, chair, room. It's not grammatically correct. And how about this? A picture containing person, feet. That's what the machinery does. The machinery doesn't make sense of this stuff. It scans some bits and says, is there anything like these bits that we've seen as patterns in other bits? Doesn't hear the dog bark. Doesn't get the dog, doesn't feel like what it feels when the dog shows up and welcomes you home. So Harry's point, and this is the entirety, what you've seen so far is the entirety of his abstract, summing up testing in 2 or 3 paragraphs. A complex judgment is needed to decide whether the software is good enough for people to happily repair the difference between what the machinery is doing and what a human would do in the same situation. And that's much more than a matter of checking to see whether the cogs spin right. Which brings us back to checking and testing. A check is a part of a test, the part of the test that can be automated. But it's mostly focused on the easy part. The punching of buttons and the comparison of output to some predicted and presumably desirable result. It's not to say it's not useful. It's a useful thing. But it's mostly focused on demonstration, not on experimentation. It's mostly focused on what we hope or believe to be true. It's not focused on, does this solve the problem for people? So it's very fast, but it's infinitely slow at recognizing trouble. So through the magic of PowerPoint transitions, the morph transition, this is a part of testing. What is testing? Because if we don't get straight on what testing actually is, we're not going to get straight on the rest of the stuff. Testing, for us in rapid software testing, is evaluating a product by learning about it through experiencing, exploring, and experimenting, which includes, to some degree, studying the product, observing it, modeling it, generating ideas, refining ideas that we've generated, expanding on ideas that we've refined on, overproducing ideas, abandoning ideas that we've overproduced, recovering ideas that we've abandoned, navigating, map making, thinking critically, evaluating risk, establishing the relevance between the test and the human needs for the test. And notice that machinery can do precisely none of those things. But testing is also more than that. It's creating the conditions necessary for evaluating a product by learning about it through experiencing, exploring, and experimenting, so that our clients, our testing clients, can make informed decisions about risk. And it's even more than that. It's developing the skill, the desire, the intention, the inclination, and the reputation for creating the conditions necessary for evaluating a product through experiencing, exploring, and experimenting. And it's also storytelling. To test, you see, is to tell three stories. For testers, testing is telling a story. It doesn't make the product better. It tells a story about the product so our clients can make informed decisions about it, about what the product is, what it does, how it behaves, how it works, how it doesn't work, how it fails, how it might fail in ways that matter to our clients and to their clients. That's what testing is really all about. But for that story to be credible, it needs a second-level story to support it, to give that story its warrant. It's a story about bugs and risk. We've got to give a story about how we tested, how we learned these things, the experiments that we performed, the evaluations that we made in order to decide, is this a problem, is this not a problem? That's a story about oracles. And we also have to tell a story about what we looked at, what we didn't look at, what we didn't have time to look at yet, what we won't be able to look at all unless conditions change. That's a story about coverage. And then there's one more level of story, which is a story about how good the testing was, the quality of the testing story, the risks of not testing this area, the value of testing this other area. It's a story about testability. It's a story about what got in our way, what made things harder or slower, more difficult, more challenging, less relevant, less valuable. And what we would need to reduce the cost of testing and the cost of development, because these issues, these obstacles that get in the way of testing, they're like the floorboards that allow the bugs to hide out underneath. Because what does the business want? The business wants a product of high value. That's how it's going to make money, sell stuff, keep customers happy. Now, of course, in order to do that, we've got to envision what a successful product is going to look like. And then we got to build some of it. So we build some of it. That is how the business gets something that it can sell. And then what do we do? Well, as we're doing that, the business probably wants to keep the cost of development low, so we build it diligently, trying to keep the cost of development low. And that's how the business remains sustainable. So far, so good. But it seems to me it's pragmatic for us to think about how things could go wrong. That's the tester's job. That's what makes me and Hype and the other testers in the room weird with respect to developers, because we're focused on problems. We're focused on anticipating failure. Now, in order to deal with the possibility of that failure, it seems to me a good idea to study what we've built. And that's how the business gets to find out if the business really got what it really wanted. And we do that by experimentation, by testing thoroughly. Not just stopping at the easy bit, not just checking the output, but asking much deeper questions, as we shall shortly see. Well, that's all wonderful. What could possibly go wrong with that? Number one, we might not be clear as we're envisioning success. We might not be clear on what the customers want. The customers are rarely clear on what they want too. And the business might not be clear on what parts of that we want to supply to the customers. So that could go wrong. Another thing that could go wrong is we might be committing easy to find, easily avoidable mistakes as we try to build a product. As we're trying to build diligently, mistakes can happen. So, I wanted to point out, committing, that's a pun. That's a little joke there. We might be committing errors and mistakes. And we might be committing them into the build repository. Oh boy, tough room, holy cow. I am available for children's parties, by the way. It might be hard to know what to build, and it might be hard to identify deep problems in the product. There might be things in the way we're building, there might be things in the way the project is set up, there might be misunderstandings we have about the customer that will make it hard to do stuff in this dimension where we're going to test thoroughly. And we do that because there may be serious problems that even if our development process has been really disciplined, there can still be problems that get by us. Deep, rare, hidden, subtle problems that escape and elude even a well-disciplined development process. I'm going to get some more coffee because I haven't had nearly enough. Allow me to do some penetration testing here. There we go. Right. Why testing? Because the business wants answers. The business needs answers to these two questions. Above all, the business is interested in these two things, which testing helps to supply. What is the actual status of the product? A tester friend of mine, Adam White, had on his resume a wonderful cut line. Adam White, preventing surprises since 1998. The other question the business wants answers to is, are there problems that threaten the value of the product or that threaten the on-time successful completion of whatever work it is we're working on right now at whatever level of granularity? This one-line change, this module, this component, this whole product. At any level of granularity, the business wants to be aware of problems that might threaten the on-time successful completion of the product, and we learn about those things through testing. Not just from checking the product, but from investigating it, interacting with it, learning about it. So, those are the 4 kinds of business risk. That leads to 4 different kinds of questions we might ask about a product under development. 1, are we sure we know what the customers want? 2, are we building what we think we're building? 3, are we ready to test efficiently? And 4, do we know about every important elusive bug? Now, I think these questions, the fact that these are quite different questions, explains a lot of the mess we see in talk about testing and in thinking about testing, because each one of these is a different kind of frame for testing. The intention frame. The frame in which we're performing the kind of testing that's involved with prototyping, reviews, customer focus groups, getting reports from the field, marketing information, and that sort of stuff. The sorts of things that will help us to understand what the customer really wants. That's testing work. We often call it review, but it's still testing. It's looking at the landscape of the product critically. Second thing, are we building what we think we're building? Well, that is the kind of testing that we call testing that happens in the discipline frame, where the programmers are trying to build the product cleanly, simply, reliably, via review, pair checking, pair testing, or peer review and pairing, shallow testing. Ooh, that sounds insulting, doesn't it? It does sound insulting, but it's not an insult. The shallowness of shallow testing is a feature. It allows developers to make maximum forward progress quickly without being too interruptive or disruptive. I mean, the developers don't want to do deep. How many people here identify as developers? Yeah, most of you. Okay. How many of you say, I love deep testing. I love exploring the product and interacting with it deeply. I love hanging out from the users. I love getting reports from the field and turning those into something understandable. How many of you love that? Yeah. Ooh, outliers. I thought Goiko might put his hand up for that. But most of you probably want to make as fast forward progress as you can because your reward system is set up for that, right? Your incentives are to build the product as quickly and as smoothly as you can, and you don't have time to shift your mindset, shift your focus to thinking, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? Because the history is littered with stories about that sort of stuff. Look at the movie General Magic, a documentary on the building of the what was supposed to be the first smartphone. Crashed and burned because the developers and the engineers were so focused on success and nobody entertained the possibility of failure. So shallow testing, though, is great for us as developers. Please, please, pretty please do lots of it, because if you do that, then we don't have to report shallow bugs. We don't have to investigate and report those shallow bugs. That saves us a lot of time, and the trade-off is we will save lots of time for you by doing deep testing more efficiently, more effectively, because we don't have to report those shallow bugs. We can do deep experiments on the product without our work being interrupted by that stuff. So developers help testers, testers help developers. Are we ready to test efficiently? Well, that's where the DevOps stuff comes in. DevOps-y kinds of stuff includes, well, practical testability includes creating efficient builds, setting the project up so that the developers and the ops people and the customers are working in close collaboration and interaction with each other. That can help us to test a lot more efficiently, so that when we get to the deep testing, what we call the realization frame. Realization is a pun as well. Realization in the sense, oh, we've got a real product here. We've realized our goals, and the other kind of realization where we realize there's problems in it. We just realized that. So that's about getting experience with the product, interacting with it, learning about it, playing with it, studying it, involving ourselves in ways that the users would do, so that we can discover deeply hidden, rare, intermittent, subtle, emergent problems that come from putting well-checked components together, such that none of the problems is in the modules individually, but a lot of problems can result from interactions between them. Okay, that's deep testing. Testing that maximizes a chance of finding every elusive bug that matters. That's the sort of stuff that we like as testers, and for the developers, it's kind of a pain in the ass because you got to switch your mindset from focusing on building to focusing on trouble. So, DevOps. We've got to get to the DevOps thing. DevOps is many things to many people we've observed. First of all, I think the canonical definition of it is developers and operations people working together to fulfill the needs of the business. Well, how fucked up did things have to get before that sounded like a new idea? Moving stuff to the cloud. In fact, this happened because I was in an interview before a conference talk with a client, and they were, what was funny was there were only two guys, and yet they had these different ideas of what it meant to start getting into DevOps. 4 different things from 2 people. But we hooked on this, the integration of development with delivery. Okay, development and delivery. The integration of development with delivery. Development with delivery. It should have been called devlivery. Or maybe for deep testing, because this sort of thing kind of stomps on deep testing, maybe it's devilry. So there's this process that comes after you finish doing something in various kinds of contexts. If you're I started my career, my first career was in theater in my 20s. And before we took a production out to a general audience, we workshopped it. For medicine, clinical trials. For a piece of writing, there's editing. Trouble with this stuff is, in DevOps, when people talk about shift left, another little kitten dies in my heart every time somebody talks about shift left. It's a weird idea, but it's got its uses. See, development and testing is kind of like this. Mama bear wants to make sure the cubs get on their way and become these independent, off you go, little bear. So when a development sees this threatening creature, this is what happens. Now, of course, it's not really supposed to be like that. See, then this is what happens for deep testing and shift left. It's not really supposed to be like that. The way it's supposed to be is that we're integrating testing with the development process. Now, that kind of testing focuses a lot more on the automated checking. It focuses a lot more on early review. We're supposed to be riding the bear. That's what it's supposed to look like. But what happens is that gets reduced a lot of the time to writing automated checks or to creating automated checks in Gherkin or BDD sort of stuff like that. And it's not without value. But what happens is it squishes the testing that happens on the right, the testing that happens with the built product, on the assumption that if we're better at the stuff on the left of the timeline, we won't have to spend so much time in the stuff on the right. The trouble is if you go from, okay, let's build it, let's check it, let's get it out there, it takes away from the time that we might need in order to become familiar with the product and the problems in it. Only shallow and simple testing can be done by expressing testing in terms of automated checking. Why? Well, earlier on, we don't know enough to test deeply. Earlier on, we haven't set up the tools that would allow us to generate lots of test data, as Paul was talking about in his talk earlier. We don't know enough the product earlier on. We have to gain experience with the product. Even from the insider's perspective, we have to do that, never mind from the outsider's perspective. We don't have, early on, we haven't created rich test data, especially pathological test data that would help us to identify weaknesses or vulnerabilities in the product. We can't automate experiential testing. Experiential testing? What's that? I'll give you an IOU. I owe you one. We'll be back. To test deeply requires experiencing the entire product, the built product, under naturalistic conditions. Capacity to test it in a realistic mode. The way that people are actually going to use it. Not the way that machinery is going to check the output, but the way people are going to interact with it and learn about it. With socially competent evaluations. Now, I said earlier that James Bach was the co-author of this presentation, and I disclaim responsibility for this pun. Okay, how does that work out? Well, we think of productivity in terms of a velocity sometimes, but velocity is kind of interesting because sometimes we might be in a zone of power, or we might be in one of two zones of regret. Two zones where we're not so good, we don't feel so good about things. We might be drifting, or we might be timid if we're too conservative. If the market, you see, this is where the bear and the tester sometimes can help each other to keep each other in the zone of power. If the market is really slow, the market doesn't move fast, then it's a good idea for the bear to be going forward and the tester not to be too trying to slow the project down by doing deep testing and discovering things. If we're too much like this, we're not going to get our product out in time. On the other hand, we don't want to get into the other zone of regret where we go from risky to reckless, because that has consequences for business and for people, for society at large. Now, even though we talk about timelines, development isn't really like that. Development is not a line, it's a fractal. Development is a fractal. That notion of intention, discipline, preparation, and realization can be applied at any level of granularity throughout the product, throughout the product development. We need all four of those things in play. That's why when testers talk about testing and developers talk about testing, I think sometimes we're at cross purposes. The developers are thinking of one kind of testing, and we as testers are thinking of another kind of testing. Development is a fractal. I'm so proud of my PowerPoint foo. Look at this. Isn't that nifty the way we do that? Yoo-hoo. So those four frames, I think, are a useful explanatory lens for talking about how testing can be done from these different kinds of perspectives. Because when people are focused on their intentions, they forget about the idea that things could go wrong. And it's a tester's job, while participating in that area, while participating in that frame, to do a couple of things. To ask for testability and to ask what could go wrong. Now, we're going to get the time to test later on only if we draw attention to those questions. So, testers, for the handful of testers here in the room, let's learn to talk about risk. Most everybody in the room is interested in these two questions. What are we building? For whom are we building it? But in review sessions, it's important for somebody to have the role. Even if it's not a dedicated tester, I'd recommend it. But if you don't have that, somebody's got to be asking what could go wrong and how would we know? That's the risk question, and that's the testability question. Well, developers like to write code. Lots of testers like to write code too. But as I said earlier, there's a big difference between checking the build and testing the product. And the preparation frame, well, okay, there's DevOpsy parts of preparation, but there are other things that a tester's mindset can bring to the table. Advocating for intrinsic testability, stuff built into the product, logging, scriptable interfaces, log files, visibility and controllability of various kinds. That doesn't happen by accident, and a lot of time those people who are focused on forward progress with the product aren't thinking about those things so that we can be ready to test efficiently. And very few developers, and maybe too few testers as well, have the determination and the patience and the time and the focus to test deeply. And then some people talk about this as manual testing. This is where I get to speak about experiential testing. I think there's a possibility that in modern development, we're spending a little too much focus on this, or even this, and we're blowing away this. This is what people call, sometimes they call this manual testing. Well, it's not manual testing. Nobody talks about manual editing. Nobody talks about manual research. Nobody talks about manual management. Nobody talks, if a journalist is writing something on a word processor, nobody says that's automated journalism. If they're writing something in a notebook, that's manual journalism. Nobody talks that way. I don't know why testers allow ourselves to be talked about this way, why we talk about ourselves this way. A tester came to me a few months ago and said, I'm worried about losing my job because management wants to automate all the testing, and I'm just a manual tester. And at that point, a vein popped. I went, boom, like that. And I said, oh, for heaven's sakes, you're not a manual tester. But I realized I didn't have a good way of putting it. So I struggled and reached and grasped. I said, no, you get experience with, you're an experiential tester. You get experience with the product that the builders of the product aren't focused on. So here's our proposed workaround for this whole manual testing business. First of all, experiential testing is testing such that if somebody were looking at it not too closely, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the tester's encounter with the product and the encounter that some contemplated user would have. It's less focused on demonstration, confirmation, showing that things are working the way they're supposed to work, and much more on experimentation, learning about how there might be problems in the product. It's the outsider's perspective, the user's perspective, and much less the insider builder's perspective. And it uses all the information available to the tester as oracles, as ways of recognizing a problem, including the tester's own feelings, the tester's ubiquitous expertise of things in the world, including the history of the product. Like a film critic. A film critic doesn't just say, well, let's see, are the colors right? The film critic looks at the story and the actors and the director's record, and it looks at the lighting and the music and the sound and sees the whole film for what it is, not just whether it spools through the projector properly. We might also, when we're talking about things that people call manual testing, we might talk about testing in terms of interaction directly with the product versus stuff that's happening in an unattended kind of way. Or exploratory testing, of which we have been big advocates for a long time, where exploratory testing is really about the agency, about the tester being able to make choices in the moment, versus scripted testing, where some outside force, not necessarily just a recipe or procedure, is shaping the tester's actions. We could talk about transformational testing, versus transactional testing. Transformational testing, where the idea is to change our mind, our perspective about the product, instead of just going through the product and saying, yep, that happened, yep, that happened, yep, that happened. In other words, whatever other kind of testing you're doing, let's remember that people are going to use the damned thing. And we'd better have encounters with the product that allow us to use the damn thing. Then comes the counter-argument. But what about Google? What about Facebook? What about Amazon? They got rid of their testers. Well, you can do that. If you're the kind of organization where you have an army of lawyers and it doesn't really matter whether the products you make are well-crafted, as long as they bring eyeballs to your advertisers, everything's more or less okay. Look at the difference, for example, between Google Sheets and Excel in terms of the richness and the usability of those two things. Excel, I don't use Google Sheets, just on principle, because it doesn't have the feature set. It's good enough for Google. But Google, let's remember, Google is an advertising company, not a software company. In that case, you only need just enough quality to keep people on your product, and maybe enough legal representation to make sure that you don't get sued, or enough good stuff to enable your little startup to get bought. These organizations do not have they have the luxury of operating without testing in a deeply responsible kind of way. And they got the money to pay the fines if they don't do that. And I can think of no better case than that, this sort of cognitive dissonance in the development world. Atlassian got rid of their testers. That's what people say all the time. And at the same time, they say, Jira sucks. How is it that we explain that? All right. So, to test a product that we've got, that we're ready to test, that we believe we understand reasonably well, is going to cause us to, in order to take advantage of the ideas of shifting left, it's more like squishing left. Because the whole idea of releasing stuff really, really, really quickly after it's built gets in the way of deep testing. So let's pause for a second and think, well, wait a minute, how can we liberate testers to do deep testing in parallel with the stuff that's happening in the build? Because the consequence is to test in the consequence on the other side, when the deep testing is squished out, is to test in production, which is great for some kinds of circumstances, not for others. To get time for deep testing, dear tester friends who are in the room, We have to learn to speak bear. We have to learn to speak in terms of risk to the product and to the business. And the trouble with that is, if all we're talking about is numbers and pass-fail percentages and test case counts and ratios and stuff like that, it's not vivid. It's just weightless. It's airy in people's minds. What I do is I set up Google alerts. I set up a Google alert for software bug, software problem, software glitch, and this is the sort of stuff that comes back. If we can tell stories about things like this, and in particular, this story that happened this past summer in Canada, Rogers, one of the national telecom networks, went down for a whole day. A whole day. And people think, oh, well, so you can't make mobile calls. Oh, what's the problem with that? Well, when the whole communications network goes down, people can't make payments. 911 services don't work. People die. People get left injured. The funniest thing was the people who worked at Rogers couldn't get into the buildings because the key systems were dependent on the Rogers telecommunications network. The only way they could fix the problem was to depend on people who had phones from Shaw or TELUS or other carriers in Canada. And if we want to talk to the business, maybe we can talk about how the business is going to have to confront Parliament and bad press and bad publicity. All right. There is time for deep testing if the business is worried, if the business is concerned. So, testers learn to speak about risk in compelling, vivid terms such that we're negotiating our feelings of dread about what could go wrong in the product so that things become much more anchored in people's minds. Asking these questions. What kind of problems might escape mechanical output checking? What are examples of such problems? What makes them possible? What makes us vulnerable to those kinds of problems? What's the worst thing that could happen? Who gets hurt? Because that has an effect on the stock price. What would we do if the worst happens? How would we get out of these problems if the worst happens? Okay, almost done. Testers should be collecting real stories of real bugs so that we can apply those things to the intention and to the discipline frame. And then we've also got to be doing market surveillance after the deep testing should have happened to find out what happens, because here's the real purpose of testing, it seems to me. The real purpose of testing is to learn from every bug, to find bugs, to discover bugs. Preventing bugs, that's a wonderful thing. But how do you know without testing that you've been successful at preventing bugs? That's it. Namaste. Thank you. I'm delighted to answer questions or to receive comments because testing's all about the feedback. So feel free to bring them right now if you like. Yes. I don't see any reason why that should not be part of an Agile team. Oh, I love this thing, the whole team approach. Don't you love that? The whole team approach. So I asked some people one time, especially these people who are very enthusiastic about the Agile testing thing and the whole team approach. I asked, so whole team, when was the last time you saw a customer support person in one of those meetings? And they said, oh, no, the whole development team. I'm sorry, if you're leaving out your customer support people, that's not the whole team. If you're leaving out the documentation people, that's not the whole team. So as somebody who's participated in every one of these things, I've been a program manager for what was at the time the best-selling piece of software in the world, which nobody by now remembers because that's how the world works. This was QAM M386 and DeskView back in the early 90s. I was program manager for those. Microsoft Windows came along, the technology landscape shifted. Windows 95 came along, solved all the problems our product was intended to solve. Poof, the company went away. But I was a program manager at that time. I've been a tester. I've been a documentation writer. I've been a programmer, doing all those things. And what that gives you, the perspective that gives you, is that there's so many more people on the team than the programmers. But when we talk about the whole team, sometimes we talk about the product owner and the programmers, and maybe a tester too. That's the whole team. I think we need, on every kind of team where we're developing something creatively that matters, it's a really good idea to have somebody in the position of the critic who's saying, this is how things can go wrong. And in theater, we do that all the, we have people who are coming in and they see the show early before it gets launched on opening night. We have people coming in to watch the show, and we get feedback from them so we can learn, is there anything we've missed? Is there anything we might want to cover? So absolutely a tester has a role in an agile team. Not necessarily somebody who has the job title tester, but we need somebody in that critic role, in that critic mindset all the time. And the developers do that when you're doing peer review, when you're doing pairing and code review and that sort of stuff. We do that because it works, because it's powerful. It's powerful to have somebody saying, okay, what could be wrong here? We have journalists for that reason, too, in society. Right? We have journalists to say, something we're not paying attention to over here. And that's a valuable role. You used to be a journalist, right? See, that's why you're so much better at much of this stuff than I am. You can get writing out. I can't write quickly and effectively at the same time. I have to confess, there's a touch of that. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to the conference organizers. And what was your name? Scott. Anytime you see a tech person in a conference like this, smile and shake hands with them and thank them, because they make it possible for us to do our stuff in ways that often don't get acknowledged. They're this invisible force that allows us to project ourselves. So thank you, Scott, as well, for your help, especially at the beginning. Thanks. Let's go eat.